The gunshot that killed Samuel Thornton echoed through the valley 3 years ago, and his widow Juliette had been feeding the hungry ever since. Rain pounded the dusty streets of Douglas, Arizona that September morning in 1882, turning the main road into a river of mud. Juliette Thornton stood beneath the wooden awning of her modest house on the edge of town, watching a lone rider approach through the downpour. His horse moved slowly, cautiously, as if the animal sensed its rider's exhaustion. She could see even from a distance that the man was slumped forward in his saddle, his hat pulled low against the rain, his shoulders hunched with fatigue or pain or both. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and stepped to the edge of her porch, squinting through the gray curtain of water. The rider was heading straight for her place, which meant he either knew about her cooking or was lost enough to take shelter at the first house he found. Either way, Juliette already knew she would feed him. That was what she did. That was all she did anymore. The man pulled his horse to a stop at her fence, and when he lifted his head, she saw a face weathered by sun and hardship, with eyes the color of storm clouds. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark stubble shadowing his jaw and a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face before the rain washed most of it away. "Madam," he said, his voice rough, "I apologize for the intrusion. I was told in town that you might have food to spare." Juliette studied him for a moment. His clothes were worn but clean, his gun belt sat easy on his hips like he knew how to use it, and his horse was well cared for despite the mud. Not an outlaw, she decided, though she had fed plenty of those too. She did not ask questions about a man's past. Hunger was hunger. "Come inside," she said. "Tie your horse under the stable awning. There is hay and water," he nodded, sliding from his saddle with a barely suppressed wince. Up close, she could see he was taller than she first thought, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean build of someone who lived in the saddle. He moved like a man who had been riding for days. Juliette retreated into her house and busied herself at the stove. She had beef stew simmering since dawn, thick with potatoes and carrots from her garden, and fresh bread cooling on the counter. The rain drummed on her roof like restless fingers while she ladled stew into a deep bowl and sliced 3 thick pieces of bread, spreading them with butter she had churned herself. The door opened and the cowboy stepped inside, removing his hat. Water dripped from his coat onto her wooden floor, forming a small puddle at his boots. "I am making a mess of your home," he said apologetically. "The floor will dry," Juliette replied. "Sit down before you fall down." He did not argue, which told her he was in worse shape than he wanted to show. He eased himself into one of the chairs at her small table, setting his hat on the empty chair beside him. His dark hair was plastered to his head, and in the lamplight, she could see more clearly the exhaustion etched into his features. She set the bowl and bread in front of him, then poured coffee from the pot she kept perpetually warm. He looked at the food with an expression she had seen many times before, gratitude mixed with something like relief, as if he had not been certain anyone would help him. "Thank you, madam," he said quietly. "Eat," she said, returning to her counter to knead the dough for tomorrow's bread. She heard him pick up his spoon, heard the soft sounds of him eating. She did not turn around. Most men who came to her door preferred to eat without being watched, their pride already bruised by the need to accept charity. She worked her dough with practiced hands, folding and pressing, while the rain continued its assault on the roof, and the stranger ate his first real meal in who knew how long. After a while, she heard him push back from the table. "Madam, I do not think I have ever tasted better stew," he said. "Or better bread." Juliette turned, wiping her hands on her apron again. The bowl was empty, scraped clean, and 2 of the bread slices were gone. The third sat half-eaten on the plate. "There is more if you want it," she said. He hesitated, and she could see the war between hunger and pride playing out on his face. Hunger won. She refilled his bowl without waiting for his answer and brought it back to the table. This time she sat down across from him, her own cup of coffee cradled between her hands. "What happened to your head?" she asked. He touched the cut gingerly. "Disagreement with a man in Tucson, nothing serious." "Looks serious enough. You should clean it properly." "I will, madam. After I finish eating, I will be on my way and out of your hair." Juliette took a sip of her coffee. "The rain is not letting up. You can wait it out in the stable if you like. There is a dry corner with clean straw." He looked at her with those storm-colored eyes, searching her face for something. "Why are you being so kind to a stranger?" "I feed the hungry," she said simply. "That is all." "That is not all," he replied. "I asked about you in town before I rode out here. They call you Angel." Juliette felt heat rise to her cheeks. She looked down at her coffee. "People say foolish things. They say you have never turned anyone away. They say you feed anyone who comes to your door, whether they are drifters or miners or men running from the law. They say you are the kindest soul in Douglas." "I just feed the hungry," Juliette repeated, meeting his eyes again. "That is all." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she felt something shift in the air between them, something she had not felt since Samuel died. It unsettled her. She stood abruptly, taking her cup to the counter. "What is your name?" she asked, keeping her back to him. "Russell Emerson," he said. "Most people call me Russ." "Where are you headed, Russ?" "Nowhere in particular. I have been working cattle drives, odd jobs, whatever pays. I thought I might find work at one of the ranches around here." "The Copper Creek Ranch is hiring," Juliette said. "They lost 3 men last month to the silver mines in Tombstone. The foreman is a fair man named Charlie Wickham. Tell him I sent you." "You would vouch for me. You do not know me." She turned to face him. "No, I do not know you. But I know hunger when I see it, and I know exhaustion, and I know a man who is trying to make an honest living. That is enough." Russell Emerson looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton," she blinked. "How did you know my name?" "They told me in town. When they told me about the angel who feeds the hungry, they called you Mrs. Thornton. Just Juliette is fine." He finished his second bowl of stew and stood, reaching for his hat. "The rain is lighter now. I should be going. Thank you again for the food and the coffee and the advice about the ranch." Juliette watched him walk to the door, watched him settle his hat on his head. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. "Mrs. Thornton, Juliette, I mean to pay you back for this kindness someday," he said. "I do not forget debts." "There is no debt," she replied. "But if you want to repay kindness, pass it forward to the next person who needs it." He nodded slowly, then stepped out into the drizzle. She stood in her doorway and watched him mount his horse, watched him ride away down the muddy street toward the north road that would take him to Copper Creek Ranch. When he was out of sight, she closed the door and returned to her kitchen, to her bread dough and her stew pot and her solitary life. But that night, lying in her bed alone as she had for 3 years, Juliette found herself thinking about storm-colored eyes and a voice rough with gratitude, and she could not quite explain why her heart felt less heavy than it had in a very long time. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the dust from the air and left everything smelling clean and fresh. Juliette rose before sunrise as always, built up her fire and started breakfast. She made extra biscuits and gravy, extra bacon, because she never knew who might come to her door. 2 miners showed up around 7, brothers from Missouri who were having a hard time of it in the copper mines. She fed them without question. A Mexican family came by around 9, parents with 3 small children traveling through to Agua Prieta. She packed them food for their journey, along with 2 jars of her preserved peaches. By noon, she had fed 11 people, and her kitchen was a disaster of dirty dishes and empty pots. She set to cleaning, humming softly to herself, a habit left over from when Samuel was alive. He had always loved her humming. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She dried her hands and answered it, expecting another hungry traveler. Instead, she found Russell Emerson standing on her porch, his hat in his hands, looking nervous. "Russ," she said, surprised, "I thought you would be at Copper Creek by now." "I was, madam. I rode out there yesterday after I left you. Mr. Wickham hired me on the spot when I mentioned your name." Started me this morning before dawn." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I came to thank you properly." "There is no need," Juliette began, but he held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. I also came to ask if you need help with anything. Repairs, heavy lifting, anything at all." "I owe you and I mean to pay that debt." "I told you there is no debt." "And I am telling you I want to help," he said firmly. "Your fence has loose boards, your stable roof has a hole in it, your garden gate is hanging crooked. I noticed these things yesterday and I have some free time this afternoon. Let me fix them." Juliette studied him. His jaw was set with determination, and she recognized the look of a man who would not take no for an answer. She sighed. "If you insist on working, I will not stop you. But you will stay for supper when you are finished." His face broke into a smile, and she was struck by how it transformed him. The weariness fell away, and she could see the young man beneath the weathered exterior. "Deal," he said. He worked through the afternoon while Juliette went about her business, cooking and cleaning and tending her garden. She tried not to watch him, but she found her eyes drawn to the window again and again. He moved with easy competence, his hands sure on the tools, his movements efficient. He repaired the fence, patched the stable roof, fixed the garden gate, and then started on a few things she had not even mentioned: loose boards on her porch, a wobbly table leg, a door that stuck. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Juliette called him inside. She had made chicken with roasted vegetables and potatoes, another batch of bread, and apple pie from the last of her dried apples. Russell washed up at her pump outside, then came in and took the same seat he had occupied the day before. This time when she sat down across from him, it felt almost natural, as if they had shared many meals instead of just two. "Tell me about yourself," she said as they ate. "Where are you from?" "Kansas originally," he said. "Small town called Ellsworth. My father raised horses, good horses." "Why did you leave?" His expression darkened slightly. "My father died when I was 20. My mother had passed when I was a boy. I had a younger brother, but he got sick that same winter after my father died. Fever took him in 3 days. I sold the ranch to pay the debts and headed west. That was 5 years ago." "I am sorry," Juliette said softly. "Loss is a heavy thing to carry." "Yes," he agreed, looking at her intently. "I think you understand that better than most," she nodded. "My husband Samuel was killed 3 years ago. Men came to rob the bank in town. Samuel worked as a clerk there. He tried to stop them." She paused, her throat tight. "They shot him. He died before the doctor could arrive." Russell reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was simple, uncomplicated, but it sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I am sorry, Juliette. That is a terrible thing." "Yes," she whispered. "It was. I thought I would die from the grief. For weeks I could barely leave my bed. Then one day a man came to my door. He was starving, desperate. I had nothing else to give the world, but I had food, so I fed him. And then I fed the next person and the next. It gave me purpose when I had none." "And now they call you Angel," Russell said gently. "I am no angel," she said, withdrawing her hand, suddenly self-conscious. "I am just a widow trying to make sense of a world without her husband." "Maybe that is what angels are," Russell said. "People who keep giving even when they have lost everything." Juliette did not know what to say to that, so she simply stood and began clearing the dishes. Russell helped without being asked, carrying plates to her counter, careful and respectful of her space. They worked in companionable silence until everything was clean and put away. At the door, Russell paused again, just as he had the day before. "May I come back?" he asked. "Not for food or charity, but just to visit, maybe help with more repairs if you need them." Juliette felt her heart skip. She had not allowed herself to feel anything like this since Samuel died. It frightened her, but it also felt like coming alive again after a long sleep. "Yes," she heard herself say, "you may come back." His smile was worth the risk. Over the following weeks, Russell became a regular presence in Juliette's life. He came by every few days, always with some excuse about repairs or helping with heavy work, but they both knew he really came for the conversation. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Juliette learned that Russell loved horses more than anything, that he had a gift with them, that his dream was to own his own ranch someday. Russell learned that Juliette had always wanted children, but she and Samuel had not been blessed before his death, that she loved to read, that she had taught herself to cook from her mother's old recipes. The people of Douglas noticed, of course. Small towns always noticed. But they seemed to approve. Juliette Thornton had mourned long enough, they said. She deserved happiness. And that Russell Emerson seemed like a good man, a hard worker, respectful and kind. One evening in late October, Russell arrived at her door with a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked on his ride from the ranch. Juliette's breath caught when she saw them, a riot of autumn colors, yellow and orange and deep red. "They are beautiful," she said, taking them with trembling hands. "Not half as beautiful as you," Russell replied, and there was something in his voice that made her look up sharply. He stood there on her porch, hat in hand, eyes serious and soft at the same time. "Juliette, I know it has not been very long since we met. I know you are still grieving your husband, and I respect that, but I need you to know that I care for you, more than I thought possible. You have become the best part of my days." Juliette felt tears prick her eyes. "Russ, I do not know if I am ready." "I am not asking you to be ready," he said, stepping closer. "I am just asking you to let me keep coming around, let me keep getting to know you, let me show you that good things can still happen, even after terrible loss." She looked down at the flowers in her hands, at the careful way he had tied them together with a piece of rawhide. She thought about how empty her house felt when he was not there, how much she looked forward to his visits, how his laugh had started to fill the hollow spaces in her heart. "You can keep coming around," she said quietly. "I would like that very much." He reached out and touched her cheek, just a whisper of contact, and she leaned into his palm before she could stop herself. "Thank you," he said. That night, Juliette placed the wildflowers in a jar of water on her kitchen table, and for the first time since Samuel died, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held more than just feeding the hungry. She imagined a future that held laughter and companionship and maybe, just maybe, love. Winter came to Douglas with surprising gentleness. The days were cool but not cold, the nights crisp but not freezing. Juliette continued her work, feeding anyone who came to her door, and Russell continued his visits, now openly courting her with the blessing of the entire town. He brought her small gifts, nothing fancy because neither of them had money for fancy but thoughtful things. A book of poetry he found at the general store, a new set of needles for her sewing, a shawl in deep blue that matched her eyes. On Christmas Eve, Russell arrived at her door with a pine tree he had cut himself, dragging it through town on his horse. Juliette laughed with delight when she saw it, the first truly joyful laugh Russell had heard from her. "It is too big," she protested. "It will never fit inside." "Then we will trim it until it does," Russell said, grinning. "Everyone should have a Christmas tree." They spent the evening decorating it with strings of popcorn and cranberries, paper stars Juliette cut from old newspapers, and candles in small tin holders. When they finished, they stood back and admired their work, and Russell slipped his arm around Juliette's waist. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "This is the best Christmas I have had in years," she said softly. "Mine too," Russell replied. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Juliette, I love you. I know it might be too soon to say it, but it is the truth, and I do not want to hide it anymore." Juliette looked up at him, at his honest face and his storm-colored eyes, and felt the last walls around her heart crumble. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not think I could love again, but you have shown me I was wrong." Russell kissed her then, soft and sweet and reverent, and Juliette felt warmth flood through her entire body. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Marry me," Russell said. "I know I do not have much to offer yet, just a job working cattle and a dream of my own ranch someday." But I promise I will spend every day trying to make you happy. Yes, Juliette said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you. They married in January of 1883, a simple ceremony in the small church in Douglas with half the town in attendance. Juliette wore a dress of cream-colored silk that had been her mother's, altered to fit her slender frame. Russell wore his best clothes, his hair neatly trimmed, his boots polished to a shine. The preacher spoke about love and commitment and the grace of second chances, and when Russell kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in applause. The celebration afterward was held at Juliette's house, which would now be their house. People brought food and drink, and someone produced a fiddle, and they danced in the street as the sun set over the Arizona desert. Juliette felt like she was floating, Russell's arms around her, his voice in her ear telling her how much he loved her, how blessed he felt, how he would spend his life making sure she never regretted choosing him. That night, alone together for the first time as husband and wife, they were tender with each other, learning each other's bodies with patience and care. Juliette had been married before, but this felt entirely different. With Samuel, she had been young and inexperienced. With Russell, she was a woman grown, and their lovemaking was a conversation of touch and breath and whispered endearments. Afterward, lying in Russell's arms, Juliette felt a peace she had not known in years. "Are you happy?" Russell asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Happier than I thought possible," Juliette replied honestly. Life settled into a new rhythm. Russell continued working at Copper Creek Ranch, proving himself to be one of the best hands they had ever employed. Juliette continued feeding the hungry, though now she had Russell's support and encouragement. He helped her expand her garden, build better storage for her preserves, even convinced Charlie Wickham to donate a side of beef now and then for her stews. The town continued to call her Angel, but now they called Russell Saint, half joking, half serious, because any man who supported his wife's charity work so fully must be some kind of saint himself. Russell just laughed it off, saying he was no saint, he was just a man who loved his wife. Spring brought new life to the desert. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, painting the landscape in 1,000 colors. Juliette's garden flourished under her careful tending. And one morning in April, she woke feeling queasy and dizzy, and she knew with a certainty that settled into her bones that she was carrying Russell's child. She told him that evening, nervous despite knowing he would be thrilled. They were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, as had become their habit, Russell's arm around her shoulders, both of them tired from a long day's work. "Russ," she said quietly, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, immediately attentive to the serious note in her voice. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Russell just stared at her, his expression stunned. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to Mexico. "A baby," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Juliette, truly, truly," she confirmed, laughing at his reaction. He kissed her then, hard and joyful, then dropped to his knees in front of her and pressed his face against her stomach. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "This is your papa. I cannot wait to meet you." Juliette ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This man, this wonderful man who had come to her door hungry and exhausted, and had somehow ended up saving her as much as she had fed him. The months of her pregnancy were the happiest of Juliette's life. Russell was attentive and loving, insisting she rest more, taking over more of the heavy work. The women of Douglas rallied around her, bringing baby clothes and blankets, sharing advice and stories. Even the rough miners and drifters who came to her door for food were gentle with her, many of them thanking her profusely for her kindness over the years and wishing her well with the baby. In December of 1883, on a cold, clear night with stars like diamonds overhead, Juliette went into labor. Russell rode like a demon to fetch the midwife, then paced outside the bedroom like a caged animal while Juliette worked to bring their child into the world. It was a long labor, nearly 15 hours, and by the time the baby's first cry pierced the air, the sun was rising over the desert. "A boy," the midwife announced, bringing the squalling infant to Russell. "A big, healthy boy." Russell took his son with shaking hands, staring down at the red-faced, dark-haired baby with absolute wonder. He carried the child to Juliette, who lay exhausted but radiant in their bed. "Look what we made," he said, his voice thick with tears. "Look at him, Juliette." She took the baby, cradling him against her chest, and felt love so fierce it was almost painful wash over her. This was her son, hers and Russell's, a miracle she had thought would never happen. "What should we name him?" she asked. Russell thought for a moment. "Samuel," he said. "If that is all right with you, to honor the man who loved you first." Juliette looked at her husband with eyes full of tears. "That is perfect," she whispered. "Samuel Russell Emerson." Life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting and absolutely wonderful. Little Samuel, whom they called Sam, was a healthy, hungry baby who kept them up at night and made them laugh during the day with his serious expressions and his surprisingly strong grip. Juliette had to cut back on the amount of people she could feed, simply because she did not have the time or energy she once did, but the town understood. And Russell, true to his nature, picked up the slack, often cooking large pots of stew on his days off from the ranch to help keep her charity work going. When Sam was 6 months old, Russell came home one evening with news that made Juliette's heart race. Charlie Wickham was retiring, moving back east to live with his daughter, and he wanted to sell Copper Creek Ranch. He had offered Russell first chance to buy it, at a price Russell could actually afford if he scraped together every penny he had saved. "It is our dream," Russell said, pacing their small house excitedly. "Our own ranch, our own land. We could raise Sam there, maybe have more children. We could build something real, something lasting." "But do you have enough money?" Juliette asked practically. "Almost," Russell admitted. "I am short about $200. Juliette stood and went to the bedroom. She returned a moment later with a small wooden box. Inside was money she had saved over the years, carefully hoarded coins and bills from the small amounts Samuel had left her, and a few pieces of her mother's jewelry she had been saving to sell if times got truly desperate. "Take it," she said, pressing the box into Russell's hands. "Use it for the ranch." "Juliette, no," Russell protested. "This is your security." "You are my security," she said firmly. "You and Sam, this ranch is our future. Take it." Russell looked at her for a long moment, then set the box down and pulled her into his arms. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Not since this morning," she teased. "Then I am falling behind. I love you, Juliette Emerson, more than words can say." They bought Copper Creek Ranch in the summer of 1884. It was not a large spread, maybe 200 acres with a decent house, a barn and grazing land for a small herd of cattle. But it was theirs, and that made it perfect. They moved in with their few possessions and baby Sam, who was now crawling and getting into everything. The work was hard. Ranching was not for the faint of heart. But Russell thrived on it, and Juliette found that she loved the space and the quiet and the sense of building something with her own hands. She still fed the hungry, but now they had to come farther to find her, and the numbers were smaller. She did not mind. She had other responsibilities now, a husband and a son and a ranch to help run. Over the next few years, their ranch grew slowly but steadily. Russell proved to be as talented at managing cattle and horses as Charlie Wickham had believed. He bought a few good breeding mares and started raising horses alongside the cattle, fulfilling his childhood dream. Juliette managed the household and the books, discovering she had a head for numbers that surprised them both. In 1886, Juliette became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, and in March of 1887, she delivered a daughter they named Margaret, after Russell's mother. Maggie, as they called her, was a tiny, delicate baby with her mother's blue eyes and her father's dark hair. Sam, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside her cradle for hours, talking to her in his toddler babble, bringing her his toys to share. Russell would watch them with such love on his face that Juliette would have to turn away to hide her tears of joy. Life was good. Hard, but good. They worked from sunrise to sunset, fell into bed exhausted every night, and woke up each morning grateful for what they had. The ranch was turning a profit, enough that they could afford to hire a hand to help Russell with the heavy work. They chose a young Mexican man named Diego Vargas, who had come to Juliette's door for food years ago and never forgotten her kindness. He was hardworking and loyal, and he became almost like family. In 1889, when Sam was 5 and Maggie was 2, Juliette found herself pregnant again. This time, she delivered twin boys, healthy and loud and absolutely identical. They named them Thomas and Timothy, and the house was suddenly overflowing with noise and chaos and love. 4 children, Russell said one night. Both of them collapsed on the porch after finally getting all the children to sleep. "We have 4 children. Are you complaining?" Juliette asked, though she was smiling. "Not for 1 second," Russell said, pulling her close. "Though I think we might need to add on to the house." They did add on, building 2 more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. The ranch continued to prosper. Russell's horses developed a reputation for quality, and they could barely keep up with demand. Sam grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved learning and books almost as much as he loved horses. Maggie was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, always into something. The twins were inseparable, communicating in their own private language that no one else could understand. The years passed in a blur of work and family and quiet moments of happiness. Juliette looked back sometimes and marveled at how far she had come from that dark time after Samuel's death. She had thought her life was over, that she would never know joy again. But Russell had shown her that the human heart had an infinite capacity for love, that healing was possible, that second chances were real. On their 10th wedding anniversary in January of 1893, Russell surprised Juliette with a trip to Tucson, just the 2 of them, leaving the children with Diego and his new wife Maria. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in a restaurant, walked the streets like young sweethearts. On their last evening there, sitting in a small cantina with mariachi music playing in the background, Russell took both of Juliette's hands in his. "Do you remember the day we met?" he asked. "When I rode up to your house in the rain, half dead with exhaustion." "I remember," Juliette said. "You looked like you might fall off your horse at any moment." "I had been riding for 3 days straight," Russell said. "I was running from my past, from my grief, from everything. I had no plan, no hope, nothing. And then you fed me. You gave me food and kindness, and you did not ask for anything in return. You saved my life that day, Juliette, not just by feeding my body, but by showing me that goodness still existed in the world." "And you saved mine," Juliette said softly. "I was drowning in grief and guilt and loneliness. I thought all I could do was feed people, that was my only purpose, but you showed me I could still live, still love, still build a life worth living." "They called you Angel," Russell said, "and they were right. You are an angel, Juliette Emerson, my angel." "I just fed the hungry," Juliette said, but she was crying now. "That is all." "No," Russell said firmly. "You did so much more than that. You opened your heart when you thought it was broken beyond repair. You let me in. You gave me a chance. You built this beautiful life with me. That is not just feeding the hungry, my love. That is grace." They kissed there in the cantina, tears on both their faces, while the mariachi band played and life went on around them. And Juliette knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They returned to the ranch to find everything running smoothly, the children healthy and happy, and a letter waiting from a rancher in California who wanted to buy 6 of Russell's horses at premium prices. Business was booming, and Russell made the decision to expand, buying an additional 100 acres that bordered their property and hiring 2 more hands to help manage the increased workload. The late 1890s brought both challenges and triumphs. A drought in 1895 tested them, forcing Russell to make hard decisions about which cattle to keep and which to sell. But they survived it, learning to be even more careful with their water management and their planning. Sam, now a teenager, proved invaluable during this time, working alongside his father with the maturity of someone much older. He had inherited Russell's gift with horses, and by the time he was 16, he was training them as well as his father. Maggie, 12 years old and beautiful, was less interested in ranch work and more interested in books and learning. Juliette taught her everything she knew, and then encouraged Russell to send her to school in Douglas, where she could get a proper education. It was expensive, but they managed it, and Maggie flourished, coming home each weekend with stories about her teachers and her studies. The twins, now 9, were wild and rambunctious, always getting into trouble but impossible not to love. They were natural cowboys, fearless and skilled, and Russell predicted they would grow up to be excellent ranch hands if they could just learn to follow directions occasionally. In 1898, when Juliette was 42 years old, she discovered she was pregnant again, a complete surprise to both her and Russell. This pregnancy was harder than the previous ones, her body older and less resilient. Russell was terrified, hovering over her constantly, insisting she rest and do nothing strenuous. Sam and Maggie helped more around the house, and the twins actually behaved themselves for once, sensing that their mother needed peace and quiet. In February of 1899, Juliette delivered another daughter, a tiny thing they named Rose. She was perfect and healthy, despite Juliette's difficult pregnancy, and she completed their family in a way none of them had expected. Sam, now 15, was surprisingly gentle with his baby sister. Maggie, 13, took to mothering her like a little doll. And the twins, 10 years old, were fascinated by how small she was. 5 children, Russell said, echoing his words from years before. We have 5 children. Are you complaining? Juliette asked, just as she had before. Never, Russell said, kissing her forehead. Every one of them is a blessing. As the new century dawned in 1900, the Emerson family gathered on their porch to watch the sunset on the last day of the old millennium. Sam was 16 now, tall and strong, already talking about taking over the ranch someday. Maggie was 14, her nose always in a book, dreaming of becoming a teacher. The twins were 11, still inseparable, still causing chaos wherever they went. And baby Rose was nearly 1, taking her first toddling steps and charming everyone she met. Russell and Juliette sat together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them watching their children with profound gratitude. They had built this life from nothing, from grief and loss and a chance meeting on a rainy day. They had created something beautiful and lasting. Do you ever think about that day? Russell asked, as if reading her mind. The day I came to your door, all the time, Juliette admitted. I think about how close I came to never answering the door. I was exhausted that day. I had already fed so many people. I almost did not answer when you knocked. Russell turned to look at her, his eyes serious. But you did. You always answered the door. That is who you are, Juliette. Someone who gives even when she is exhausted, someone who feeds the hungry no matter what. I just feed the hungry, Juliette said, smiling at the old phrase. That is all. That is everything, Russell corrected gently. That is love in action, that is grace, that is what saved us both. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red and purple. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Diego and Maria were closing up the barn for the night. Somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing softly. I have been thinking, Russell said eventually, about expanding our charity work. We have the resources now. What if we formalized what you have been doing all these years? Set up a proper system for feeding people in need, not just those who happen to come to our door. Juliette looked at him in surprise. You mean like a charitable organization? Exactly. We could work with the church in Douglas, maybe set up a regular schedule. A few days a week where people know they can come for a hot meal. We could involve other families, make it a community effort. That would be wonderful, Juliette said, her mind already racing with possibilities. But it would be expensive. We can afford it, Russell said. The ranch is doing well. The horses are selling better than ever. And more importantly, it is the right thing to do. You taught me that, Juliette. You taught me that we have an obligation to help those less fortunate, to give back when we have been blessed. Juliette leaned against her husband, feeling love swell in her chest. When did you become so wise? The day I met you, Russell said simply. Everything good in my life started that day. They implemented Russell's plan over the next year, working with the church and several other families in Douglas to establish a regular feeding program. Every Wednesday and Saturday, anyone who needed a meal could come to the church and receive hot food, no questions asked. Juliette oversaw the cooking, training other women in her recipes and methods. Russell handled the logistics and funding, ensuring they always had enough supplies. The program was a tremendous success. What had started as Juliette's personal mission to feed the hungry had grown into a community-wide effort that fed dozens of people every week. The townspeople called it Angel's Kitchen, despite Juliette's protests. She insisted she was not special, that she was just doing what anyone should do. But the people who were fed, who were shown dignity and kindness in their time of need, they knew better. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Sam grew into a fine young man and at 20, married a sweet girl named Annie from a neighboring ranch. They built a small house on the Emerson property and started their own family, making Russell and Juliette grandparents for the first time. Maggie went away to teacher's college in California, writing long letters home about her studies and her dreams. The twins, now in their late teens, were still inseparable and showed no signs of ever wanting to leave the ranch. They were born cowboys through and through. Little Rose grew into a bright, cheerful child who loved helping her mother in the kitchen and distributing food to the hungry at Angel's Kitchen. She had Juliette's generous heart and Russell's easy way with people, and everyone predicted she would do great things with her life. In 1908, on a warm spring evening, Russell and Juliette celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children, some now with children of their own, threw them a party at the ranch. The entire community of Douglas turned out, bringing food and music and stories of how the Emersons had touched their lives over the years. Person after person stood up to share how Juliette had fed them when they were hungry, how Russell had given them work when they needed it, how the family had embodied kindness and generosity. Russell stood to give a speech, pulling Juliette up beside him. 25 years ago, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, I rode up to a small house in Douglas, Arizona, hungry and exhausted and hopeless. A woman answered the door and she fed me without asking questions. She gave me food and kindness and hope. That woman became my wife, the mother of my children, and the love of my life. He turned to Juliette, taking both her hands. I have spent the last 25 years trying to be worthy of you, Juliette Emerson, trying to match your generosity, your kindness, your endless capacity to love. I do not know if I have succeeded, but I promise I will spend the rest of my life trying. Juliette was crying openly now, not caring who saw. You have more than succeeded, she said. You have given me everything I thought I lost. You have shown me that life can be beautiful again after tragedy. You have loved me and our children with everything you have. You are the best man I have ever known, Russell Emerson. They kissed while the crowd cheered and applauded, and then they danced, just as they had on their wedding night 25 years before. The years had marked them. Russell's hair was gray at the temples. Juliette had lines around her eyes and mouth. But they were still those same two people who had found each other in the rain, who had built a life from love and determination and faith. As the party wound down and the guests departed, Russell and Juliette walked hand in hand through their ranch, looking at everything they had built. The house they had expanded, the barn Russell had rebuilt, the corrals full of fine horses, the pastures full of healthy cattle. But more than that, they looked at their children and grandchildren, at the legacy of love and kindness they had created. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" Russell asked. "When I told you they called you Angel, I said I just feed the hungry," Juliette replied. "That is all." "And you were wrong," Russell said, smiling. "You did so much more than that. You built a life of purpose. You raised wonderful children. You created a community of people who look out for each other. You loved a broken man back to wholeness. That is not just feeding the hungry, my darling. That is changing the world, one person at a time." Juliette looked out over the land as the sun set, painting everything in golden light. She thought about the girl she had been, young and in love with Samuel Thornton. She thought about the widow she had become, lost in grief and searching for purpose. She thought about the day a cowboy rode up to her door in the rain and changed everything. "I love you," she said to Russell, "for seeing me when I could not see myself. For loving me when I thought I could not be loved, for building this life with me." "I love you too," Russell said, "and I always will." They stood together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, two people who had found each other against all odds and had built something extraordinary. Their story had started with a simple act of kindness, a widow feeding a hungry cowboy, and it had grown into a lifetime of love and purpose and joy. The years that followed were gentler, slower. Russell gradually turned over more of the ranch operations to Sam, who proved to be an even better rancher than his father, if that was possible. Maggie came home from California with a teaching certificate and opened a small school on the Emerson Ranch for the children of their workers and neighboring families. The twins, Thomas and Timothy, finally married sisters from a ranch near Tombstone and continued working the Emerson land with the same dedication they had shown since childhood. Rose, now a young woman of 18, had taken over much of the management of Angel's Kitchen, bringing fresh energy and new ideas to the charitable work her mother had started. Russell and Juliette settled into the role of ranch patriarchs, advising when asked, but mostly just enjoying the fruits of their labor. They spent their days working in Juliette's garden, playing with their growing number of grandchildren, and sitting on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the land they loved. In the spring of 1915, Douglas, Arizona held a celebration for the 30th anniversary of Angel's Kitchen. The charitable feeding program that Juliette had started alone had grown to feed over 100 people every week, with satellite programs started in neighboring towns based on her model. The governor himself came to the celebration, presenting Juliette with a commendation for her decades of service to the poor and hungry. Juliette stood before the crowd, now 60 years old but still vibrant and strong, and gave a short speech. "I am not special," she said, her voice firm. "I am just a woman who saw hungry people and decided to feed them. That is something anyone can do. Every one of you has the power to change someone's life with a simple act of kindness. Do not wait for permission. Do not wait for recognition. Just do the work. Feed the hungry. Help the lost. Love the broken. That is what we are here for." The crowd erupted in applause, but Juliette just smiled and stepped down from the podium, returning to Russell's side. He took her hand and squeezed it. "Still insisting you are not special," he teased. "I am not," she insisted. "I just feed the hungry, that is all." "That is everything," Russell said, just as he had said so many times before. "That is love, and love is what makes us special." That night, lying in bed together, Russell pulled Juliette close. They had shared this bed for over 30 years, had loved each other through good times and hard times, through sickness and health, through everything life had thrown at them. "Juliette," he said softly, "if I could go back to that day in the rain, knowing everything that would come after, I would make the same choice 1,000 times over. Riding to your door was the best decision I ever made." "And answering it was mine," Juliette replied. "I almost did not, you know, I was so tired that day. But something made me open that door. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was God, maybe it was just luck, but whatever it was, I am grateful for it every day. They fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had for 3 decades. Two souls intertwined so completely that neither could imagine life without the other. The next few years were peaceful. Russell was now in his mid-50s and starting to feel the wear of decades of hard physical labor, but he was still active and engaged with the ranch. Juliette, at 62, had finally begun to slow down, letting Rose and the other younger women take on more of the cooking for Angel's kitchen. But she still showed up every Wednesday and Saturday, still smiled and talked with everyone who came through the door, still embodied the spirit of generosity that had defined her life. Sam and Annie now had 5 children of their own, and their eldest son was showing the same talent with horses that had marked Russell and Sam. Maggie's school had grown to 30 students, and she had married a businessman from Douglas, a widower with 2 children of his own. The twins had each fathered 4 children, and they joked that they were in competition to see who could have the largest family. Rose, at 24, had married a young doctor who had come to work in Douglas, and they were expecting their first child. The Emerson family had grown large and sprawling, with grandchildren and great-grandchildren spread across southern Arizona. But they all came together regularly at the ranch, filling the house with noise and laughter and love. Russell and Juliette would sit on their porch during these gatherings, watching their legacy run and play and grow, and they would hold hands and marvel at how blessed they were. In the fall of 1919, Russell caught a chill that turned into pneumonia. He was 59 years old and had always been healthy, but the illness hit him hard. The doctor came and did what he could, but medicine in Douglas, Arizona in 1919 was still limited. Juliette nursed her husband with all the skill and devotion she possessed, sitting by his bedside day and night, feeding him broth, bathing his fevered skin, praying for his recovery. For 2 weeks, Russell fought the illness. In his lucid moments, he would talk to Juliette about their life together, about the children, about how proud he was of everything they had built. He made her promise to keep Angel's kitchen running, to continue feeding the hungry, to never lose that generous spirit that had first drawn him to her. On a clear October night, with Juliette holding his hand and all their children gathered around, Russell Emerson took his last breath. He died peacefully, a smile on his face, surrounded by the family he had helped create and the woman he had loved for 36 years. Juliette thought she might die too from the sheer weight of grief. She had been through this before with Samuel, but this was different. This was Russell, her second chance, her great love, the man who had saved her and built a life with her. How could she go on without him? But she had 5 children who needed her, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She had Angel's kitchen and the hundreds of people who depended on it. She had a ranch to help manage and a legacy to protect. So Juliette did what she had always done. She got up. She kept going. She fed the hungry. The first year without Russell was the hardest. Juliette would wake in the night reaching for him, forgetting for a moment that he was gone. She would see something during the day that she wanted to tell him about, only to remember that he was not there to tell. But slowly, painfully, she learned to live with the loss. She kept him alive in stories, telling her grandchildren and great-grandchildren about the cowboy who had ridden up to her door in the rain, about his kindness and his strength and his love. Sam ran the ranch now, and he ran it well, honoring his father's memory in everything he did. Maggie's school continued to thrive. The twins kept the cattle and horses in top condition. Rose and her doctor husband opened a small clinic in Douglas, offering free care to those who could not afford to pay, continuing the family tradition of service. And Juliette, now in her mid-60s, continued to show up at Angel's kitchen every Wednesday and Saturday without fail. People marveled at her, this woman who had known such loss but who continued to give, who continued to feed the hungry, who continued to embody grace and generosity. When people asked her how she kept going, how she found the strength, she would smile and say, "I just feed the hungry. That is all." But those who knew her understood it was so much more than that. It was love in action. It was a promise kept to a man who had changed her life. It was a testament to the power of kindness to transform the world. The years continued to pass. The 1920s brought change to Arizona and to Douglas. The town grew and modernized. Cars became common on the streets. Electricity came to most homes. The world was changing rapidly, but some things remained constant. The Emerson Ranch continued to prosper under Sam's management. Angel's Kitchen continued to feed the hungry. And Juliette Emerson continued to be the heart and soul of Douglas, Arizona. In 1925, on what would have been her 42nd wedding anniversary, Juliette visited Russell's grave in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch. She did this every year, bringing fresh flowers and spending time talking to him as if he could hear her. 42 years, she said, arranging the wildflowers she had picked that morning, the same kind he had brought her all those years ago. Can you believe it has been 42 years since we married, and 6 years since you left me? She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. I miss you every day, my love, but I am still here, still doing the work, still feeding the hungry just like you made me promise. She sat on the grass beside his headstone, looking out over the ranch and the land they had built their life on. Our grandchildren are having children now. Can you imagine? We have great-great-grandchildren, Russ. The family just keeps growing. Sam is talking about buying more land. Maggie's school has over 60 students now. The twins are finally starting to slow down a little, though they will never admit it. And Rose, our baby, she has 3 children of her own now, all of them beautiful. She fell silent, just sitting with him in the quiet of the cemetery. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Juliette could almost feel Russell beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his voice in her ear telling her he loved her. I will see you again someday, she whispered. But not yet. There is still work to do, still people to feed. Still love to give. She stood slowly, her joints protesting a little, and touched his headstone one last time. Wait for me, my darling. I will come to you when it is time. Juliette lived for another 15 years after that day, continuing her work almost until the very end. She saw the stock market crash of 1929 and the beginning of the Great Depression, which made Angel's Kitchen more necessary than ever. The lines grew longer, the faces more desperate, but Juliette never turned anyone away. Even when she was in her 70s and could barely stand for long periods, she was there, serving food, offering words of encouragement, giving hope to those who had none. In 1940, at the age of 84, Juliette Emerson finally laid down to rest. She had been working at Angel's Kitchen that morning, as she always did on Saturdays. She came home, sat down in her favorite chair on the porch, and quietly passed away, a smile on her face and peace in her heart. The funeral was the largest Douglas, Arizona, had ever seen. People came from all over the state and beyond to pay their respects to the woman who had fed them, helped them, loved them. The church could not hold everyone, so they held the service outside. Speaker after speaker told stories of Juliette's kindness, her generosity, her unwavering commitment to feeding the hungry. Sam, now 63 years old and looking more like his father every day, gave the final eulogy. My mother, he said, his voice breaking with emotion, was the best person I have ever known. She taught us that love is action, not just words, that we have an obligation to help those less fortunate, that every person deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. He paused, collecting himself. People called her Angel. She always brushed it off, saying she just fed the hungry, that was all, but we knew better. We knew she was special. She saved my father's life when he came to her door all those years ago. She saved countless others with her food and her kindness. She saved me and my siblings and my children and my grandchildren by showing us how to live with purpose and meaning. He looked out over the massive crowd, at all the faces of people his mother had touched. She is gone now, but her work continues. Angel's Kitchen will keep running. We will keep feeding the hungry. We will keep honoring her memory by living the way she taught us to live, with generosity, with kindness, with love. They buried Juliette beside Russell, on the hill overlooking the ranch so they could be together again at last. On her headstone, beneath her name and dates, they carved a simple inscription that captured her entire life. She fed the hungry. That was all. That was everything. Angel's Kitchen continued to operate for decades after Juliette's death, run by her descendants and the community she had inspired. The Emerson Ranch remained in the family, passed down from generation to generation, a testament to what two people could build with love and hard work. And the story of the cowboy who rode up to a widow's door in the rain and the angel who fed him became a legend in Douglas, Arizona, told and retold to illustrate the power of kindness to change lives. Because in the end, that was what Juliette and Russell's story was about. Not just romance, though their love was deep and true. Not just survival, though they had certainly overcome hardship. Their story was about the transformative power of simple kindness, about how a bowl of stew and some fresh bread could save a life. About how opening your door to a stranger could lead to a lifetime of love. About how feeding the hungry was never just about food, but about recognizing the humanity in everyone and responding with grace. Their legacy lived on in every person who was fed at Angel's Kitchen, in every child who learned to read at Maggie's school, in every patient who received free care at Rose's clinic, in every horse that was raised with care on the Emerson Ranch. It lived on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the values Juliette and Russell had embodied. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Russell and Juliette were together again. He was probably telling her she was an angel, and she was probably insisting she just fed the hungry, that was all. And they were both right. Because sometimes feeding the hungry is an act of grace. Sometimes kindness is angelic. And sometimes, a cowboy and a widow can build something so beautiful, so lasting, that it echoes through generations. Their story began with a simple phrase spoken on a rainy day in 1882. "They call you Angel." And her response, "I just feed the hungry, that's all." But those words contained the seeds of a great love story, a lasting legacy, and a lesson that would outlive them both. That we are at our best when we give without expecting anything in return. That love can bloom even in the ashes of loss. That second chances are real. And that sometimes, the greatest adventures begin when we simply answer the door.